Let's explore a short story today. This short story was published in a magazine called All Famous Police Cases in February of 1953. The story is called The Mystery of the Hidden Jewels. From time to time, we will stop reading and talk about any interesting words or phrases that could be useful for you. All right, well, here, let's start exploring the mystery of the hidden jewels. Dan Garrett and Mike Manigan, rookie policemen, were discussing the events of the morning as they cruised through New York's theatrical district in a police car on routine duty. Rookie is a word that means beginner, amateur, something like that. So these are not experienced policemen. These are amateur policemen, beginner policemen. And cruising is like driving through the New York theater district, cruising through the New York theater district. It kind of means the same thing. Only that morning, Inspector Flanagan had talked to them about the case that would soon rock all of New York. The famous financier and diamond importer Jonathan Fearless had disappeared from his home and his office in the financial district. No one had seen or heard from him for 3 days. The entire police force was on the lookout, but so far there was not the slightest clue. The word rock here is kind of like rock as in earthquake. So the news rocked New York. Sounds like the news caused chaos in New York. Everyone was shocked at the news. And slight means a little or small. So when they say there was not the slightest clue, they're saying there's not even a little clue. There was no clue, not even something very small. Later, as they sat over their coffee and donuts, they read the headlines, but the reporters seemed to know as little about the mysterious disappearance as did the police. To sit over your breakfast, to sit over your lunch, to sit over your dinner means sitting at the table with your food in front of you, but doing something different, doing something else. They sat over their breakfast discussing the crime. The breakfast was in front of them, but they weren't eating. They were talking. They were discussing the crime. Suddenly, as they cruised along Broadway, they heard a call that startled them over the shortwave radio system. "Proceed at once to the Empire State Theater on West 46th Street. Murder reported." To be startled means to be surprised or shocked or scared. The call startled them means the call surprised them, scared them, shocked them. Dan Garrett and Mike Manigan were right in the vicinity, and they raced to the spot with the screaming sirens. "At last," said Mike, "things are beginning to perk up. I was beginning to be bored with this run, but something tells me things will pop from now on, and we will be in the thick of it." Perk up is a phrasal verb that means become more energetic, become more excited, maybe even more interested or interesting. They were having a boring day, but now that they have an interesting and exciting call, he says things are beginning to perk up. If you have ever tried to talk to a dog and that dog is interested in what you're saying and paying attention, you know the look of a dog whose ears have perked up suddenly interested and paying attention, like this picture here of my puppy, Lucky. The Empire State Theater. At the Empire State Theater, they pulled up sharp, and Mike Madigan began to race for the front door when Dan Garrett stopped him. "Not that way," he shouted. "You'll have to go through the audience, and you might start a panic. Try the alley. Over there, it will probably lead to the stage door." Dan was right, it did lead to the stage door, and they went on through to the stage. Quite a crowd had collected there beside the cast. The curtain had been lowered, and the audience was leaving already. Donald Cooper, the manager of the theater, came up, and they asked him for details. First, they cleared the stage. "You members of the cast," ordered Dan, "just wait in the dressing rooms, and the rest of you wait in the corridor. Mike, see that no one here leaves." Mike Cooper told them what happened, and it was near the end of the first act. John Fairless and Maria Fontaine, the stars, were seated in the library. John Fairless rose and went to the piano. "I'll never give up the jewels," he said. "For this, I have traveled across these 7 seas, and I refuse to be scared into losing everything I have gained by my own efforts." Then the lights went out, and there were 3 shots. 3 shots rang out in the dark, and someone in the audience screamed, but that was to be expected, for this was a mystery play, The Cry in the Dark. And then the curtains came down. Mr. Cooper was in the box office when his stagehand came rushing out for him. "You're wanted backstage, sir. There's been an accident. I'm afraid it's the star, John Fearless." Mr. Cooper followed the stagehand. John Fearless at the piano was bleeding badly from 2 wounds, but for some unaccountable reason, he was playing the piano with his last strength. Mr. Cooper helped him to the sofa and then raised to the phone. He called the police and then drew aside the curtains and addressed the audience, which had returned for Act 2. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "there has been an accident. I'm afraid the matinee performance cannot be completed. As you leave the theater, if you will stop at the box office, we will either refund your money or give your tickets for a later date. Please accept apologies of the management." Then Mr. Cooper returned to the scene of the shooting. Mr. John Fearless was dead. Maria Fontaine, the star of many successes, sat beside him. She was sobbing, and that was all Mr. Cooper could report. Sobbing is similar to crying, but it is stronger and more physical than crying. She was sobbing, so you can picture her whole body moving up and down, and she's making a lot of noise. Dan called Maria Fontaine. She could add little to no evidence. They had gone through the scene just as it was written, with John Fearless had walked to the piano, and there were 3 shots, and then the curtain fell. But John Fearless did not leave the stage. He clutched the piano and sat playing. He was trying to tell her something, but one of the bullets had struck him in the throat, and he could not speak. He was trying to tell her something by his playing, but she couldn't figure it out. Then Mr. Cooper came back and took charge. He phoned the police, then addressed the audience, and by the time he returned, John Fearless had collapsed. He was dead. To clutch something is similar to grab something. And the difference is in the 2 words is that clutch has more purpose to it and grab has less purpose. By saying he clutched the piano, it sounds like he grabbed the piano with the purpose, perhaps to support his weak body. So he clutched the piano in order to support himself so he could sit up. Dan asked the usual routine questions of the rest of the cast, and then Inspector Anthony arrived and took over. "Inspector," said Dan, "there's one thing I would like to know. Is there any connection between John Fearless, the actor, and Jonathan Fearless, the financier, who had disappeared?" The inspector went to the phone, and in a few minutes he had the answer. John was the son of Jonathan Fearless. Though they have been estranged for nearly a year, The inspector suggested that Dan and his pal go to the home of Jonathan Fearless on West 86th Street and look around. They were to wait there for the inspector. Now, estranged means separated or alienated, supposed to be together, but not together. So when we say that John was his estranged son, it means John was his son, but they are separate. They don't talk or have contact with each other, even though you would expect them to. By the way, Inspector Dan asked, isn't it a good idea to find out just what piece of music John Fearless was playing, if he meant it to be a clue? The inspector did think it a good idea, and Mary Fontaine gave them the answer. It was the Moonlight Sonata. Mary Fontaine gave them the answer. It was the Moonlight Sonata. On the way down to the big old house on West 86th Street where John Fearless had lived, the Moonlight Sonata. It had made no sense. As soon as they entered the house, John asked the housekeeper whether John Fearless had been fond of music. Yes, the housekeeper. Yes, said the housekeeper. He often played the piano. Did you ever hear him play the Moonlight Sonata? To be fond of something is a nice way of saying that you like something. So we can say John likes music, or we can say it in a much more polite way, a nicer way. John is fond of music. This is actually very useful when you want to talk about things you don't like, because fond sounds so much nicer and polite than like. It's a good way of talking about things you don't like. Mary doesn't like spicy food. This sentence is fine, but it would sound much nicer if we used fond. She isn't fond of spicy food. Sounds much nicer than don't like. She isn't fond of spicy food. There is a piece he often played, especially late at night. I don't know the name of it. Yes, it was the Moonlight Sonata. I remember hearing it on the radio, and come to think of it, that was the music that he played late last night. I seem to remember now he became very excited and he watched me as I went up to the bed. But before I fell asleep, I distinctly remember him playing that song. I could not help wondering about it. The piano was in a huge library, and the walls were lined with books on many subjects, mostly on the theater. Dan and his pal searched carefully, but there was nothing that resembled a clue. Dan sat down at the piano and idly played Moonlight Sonata, and his pal Mike stood behind him listening. Then they heard a voice. "Get your hands up." To be idle means to do nothing. So if I say he is an idle person, it means he never does anything. He is lazy. If we say he does something idly, that means he does something without thinking about it, to do it for no reason or no purpose. So when they say he sat at the piano and idly played, it means there was no reason for the playing. He just did it without thinking about it. The word pal is a funny word for friend. Pal, chum, buddy, these are just funny ways of saying friend. They turned. A section of the library shelves had swung out, and a man stood in the opening, holding a gun. Now they understood what the music meant. They were to play the piano and set off an electronic device, attuned to the Moonlight Sonata. When Dan played the tune, the wall swung open, and someone had been hiding inside. Here he was. They felt foolish. "I've seen your picture," said Dan to the stranger. "You are Jonathan Fearless, the financier and diamond importer. Don't you know the police are looking for you?" "Of course, you must know. You're hiding here in the little room behind the bookcase. You're hiding because you killed your son at the theater this afternoon. You quarreled with him, although I do not yet know why." "You are a bright young man, but it won't do you any good," said the stranger. "I killed my son to protect myself, and I will kill you and your pal as well." To quarrel is another way to say to have a fight. So this phrase, "you quarreled with your son," means you had an argument with your son. You fought with your son. The housekeeper stood in the doorway. She disappeared for a moment, and when she returned, she held a broom in her hand. She reached out suddenly, and the broom knocked the gun out of Jonathan's hand. Mike tackled Jonathan, and he came crashing to the floor. Dan was already through the opening. There he found a satchel, and in it a fortune and jewels. Famous jewels. "We've been looking for these too," he announced. "They're the jewels the Nazis stole from various museums in Europe. You were trying to sell them for the Nazis, and your son found out, so you killed him." Mike called the inspector. "Tell him we've solved the mystery for him, the mystery of the hidden jewels." And that concludes the case of the hidden jewels, the mystery of the hidden jewels. What did you think of this way of learning vocabulary? Did you enjoy this? Please leave some comments and let me know if you would like to see more videos like this one.